Logan walked into the courtroom wearing a faded flannel shirt, worn-down shoes, and the kind of expression that gave nothing away. He had arrived in a rusted pickup truck that groaned when it turned into the parking lot. Charlotte stood beside her expensive attorney, looked Logan over once and leaned toward her new boyfriend. They both smiled. The judge called the session to order, and Logan took his seat without looking at anyone. He sat straight, calm, and said nothing. Then a sound came through the windows, a jet engine descending. Everyone turned. A private plane was landing nearby. What was Logan hiding the moment he walked into that courtroom? The answer will change everything you thought you knew. Logan woke at 5 in the morning the way he had every day for the past 14 years. The apartment was a single bedroom on the second floor of a nondescript building in a quiet suburb, the kind of place where the hallway always smelled faintly of other people's cooking, and the elevator had been out of service since the previous spring. Inside, the furniture was sparse without being sad. A wooden desk that had survived 2 relocations, a coffee mug with a chipped handle that he had never gotten around to replacing, and a closet with enough shirts to get through a week. There was nothing in the room that declared anything about the man who lived there. That was, in its own quiet way, a deliberate choice. He moved through the morning without hurry. He made coffee in a drip machine that was older than most of the cars in the lot outside, stood by the small window while it brewed, and watched the street below come slowly to life. A jogger, a garbage truck making its rounds, a neighbor walking a dog that refused to cooperate with any urgency. Logan did not find the scene depressing. The ordinary rhythms of a morning had always steadied him in a way that nothing expensive ever had. He drank his coffee standing up, looking out, and when the mug was empty, he rinsed it in the sink and set it on the dish rack the way he had every morning for years. He dressed with more care than usual. The day required it. From the back of the closet he pulled the one outfit he kept for occasions that demanded something approaching formal, a collared shirt in pale blue, slightly faded at the cuffs, and a pair of dark trousers that had held their shape well enough. He stood in front of the small bathroom mirror for a moment. Not to study himself, exactly. More the way a person pauses before walking through a door they have thought about for a long time, taking one measured breath before the thing itself begins. On the desk lay a thin folder of documents that Diana had messengered over 2 days before, along with a handwritten note on a torn piece of legal pad paper. Caleb's handwriting, compact and unhurried, Flight 915. We'll be there on time. Logan read through the folder one final time, not because he had forgotten anything inside it, but because he was the kind of man who did not walk into important rooms without confirming that everything was where he had put it. The documents were in order. They had been in order since Diana assembled them. Logan closed the folder and set it back on the desk. He picked up the old flip phone, dialed, and waited. 2 rings. Caleb answered on the second. Logan said 4 words. Caleb said 3 back. That was all that needed saying. Logan set the phone down, picked up the folder, and tucked it under his arm. The apartment looked the same as when he had woken. He pulled the door shut behind him. The Ford F-150 was parked in the shared lot behind the building, between a late-model sedan and an SUV that belonged to the family in the unit across the hall. The truck was a 2003 model, the paint long since surrendered to a reddish rust that spread in patches along the lower doors and wheel wells. One side mirror had been replaced with a unit that did not quite match the original, slightly larger, a different shade of black, fixed by Logan himself with a socket wrench on a Sunday afternoon several years back. He had never felt any particular need to find a closer match. He placed his hand on the doorframe for a moment before opening it, not sentimentally. Just the way a man touches something familiar before asking it to carry him one more time. He drove through the city without the radio. The morning traffic moved in the slow, patient way it always did, and Logan moved with it. At one point, the route carried him past a residential street of older houses with wide front porches, the kind of street where the trees had been there long enough to form an arch above the road. He had lived on a street like that once. He drove past, without slowing down, without turning his head, the way a person passes a place they have made their peace with. When the courthouse appeared at the end of a long straightaway, he took the turn into the parking lot and found a space at the far edge, away from the cluster of newer vehicles gathering near the entrance. He cut the engine. He sat for a moment with his hands resting on the wheel, looking at the building through the glass. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the cool morning air. Diana was waiting just inside the glass entrance doors, a black briefcase at her side and her dark hair pulled back cleanly. She was 32 years old and carried herself with the particular economy of someone who had stopped expending energy on anything unnecessary a long time ago. When she saw Logan come through the doors, she moved to meet him without hurrying. They exchanged the greeting of two people who have done their planning and arrived at the day itself. No anxiety in it, no reassurance required. Diana said Caleb had confirmed his landing time. Logan said he knew. She said that Sebastian had filed a supplemental motion that morning, formally requesting subpoena access to Aerocraft's financial records. Logan considered this for a moment and said that was fine. Diana looked at him. He looked back. She nodded once, and they walked together toward the courtroom. Charlotte arrived 8 minutes later, and she arrived the way Charlotte always arrived anywhere that mattered to her. With preparation, with presentation, and with Jason 2 steps behind her as both an accessory and a reinforcement. Jason wore a deep navy suit that sat on him the way expensive things do when a man has worn them long enough to stop noticing the price. His watch was a Rolex Submariner, steel with a black face, the kind of watch that did not shout but made itself known. Charlotte wore a structured dress in charcoal gray and carried a bag that Logan would not have been able to name by brand, but that Diana identified in 3 seconds. Sebastian walked just ahead of them, occasionally leaning toward Charlotte to murmur something that made her nod. He was the kind of attorney who treated every corridor as preparation for the room ahead, and he had been preparing Charlotte for this particular room for 6 months. Charlotte saw Logan the moment she entered the hallway. For just a fraction of a second, her expression registered something between surprise and recognition, the reflex of a person encountering something they expected but had not quite fully believed would be real. Then it shifted. The lines around her mouth changed, and she leaned close to Jason, and whatever she said made him look across the hall at Logan and smile in a way that was not quite a smirk, but close enough that the distinction barely mattered. Jason's eyes moved over Logan's shirt, his trousers, his shoes, and then away again, with the dismissiveness of a man who has made a judgment and considers it settled. Logan watched all of it from across the corridor and said nothing. He was still standing in the same spot when they passed through the courtroom doors ahead of him. The courtroom was smaller than the kind seen in films, with plain wood paneling and fluorescent lighting that gave the room a quality of relentless clarity, as though nothing soft could survive inside it for very long. Judge Owen had the permanent look of a man who had heard every possible version of every possible story and had stopped being surprised by any of them, which was perhaps the quality most essential to a family court judge. He called the session to order in the brisk, efficient manner of someone who considered ceremony and delay 2 branches of the same failing. Sebastian opened for Charlotte's side with the practiced confidence of a man whose argument had been rehearsed until it no longer sounded rehearsed. He built his case in ascending layers. Logan's modest apartment, the aged truck, the income records that corresponded to a man of decidedly ordinary means. Then, in careful contrast, he described a pattern of financial anomaly, large transfers, layered corporate structures, a web of documented connections that Logan had, Sebastian suggested, carefully obscured behind legal arrangements complex enough to require a specialist to unravel. The word he reached for was opaque. He used it 3 times. Each time it landed with the clean, deliberate sound of a word that had been chosen in advance. He called Logan's presentation of himself a kind of financial theater, a deliberate performance of simplicity designed to shield substantial assets from a fair legal process. Charlotte took the stand briefly and spoke with the composed, slightly pained expression of someone who has been wronged in a way too complicated to explain in a short amount of time. She described a husband who kept the finances in a separate compartment of their shared life, who deflected her questions about the business with answers that were technically accurate and practically useless, who had always seemed to carry more than he chose to share. She said the word trust twice, once in relation to what she had extended, once in relation to what had not been returned. She was credible, and she was credible in part because she was not entirely wrong. That was what made it complicated. She had prepared the expression the same way she had prepared everything else for today. Jason sat in the observer's gallery with his legs crossed and his arms folded, watching the proceedings with the settled attention of a man who believes he already knows how things will end. Sebastian sat back down. The room waited. Logan had not moved since the session began, had not looked at Charlotte, had not whispered to Diana beyond a brief exchange of notes on a legal pad. Diana had written down everything. Logan had written down almost nothing. When Diana rose and stated that her client's documentation was in transit and would arrive before the end of the session, Sebastian objected with the speed of someone who had anticipated it. Judge Owen looked at Diana. Diana met his gaze without elaboration. Owen granted the request and allowed the session to continue while the recess was scheduled. Logan looked at the clock on the wall. The time was what it needed to be. The history of a marriage is never a single story. What Sebastian presented through careful structure was one version, a chronicle of distance and concealment, a husband more devoted to a business he refused to explain than to the household he had agreed to share. It was a version that contained truth. That was what gave it its weight, and what made it, in its selective accuracy, something other than the whole picture. Logan had met Charlotte in 2013, at a conference in Austin where he had gone to discuss a maintenance contract with potential clients. She had been there with a colleague and had laughed at something Logan said in passing, a dry, specific observation about the catering that he had not expected anyone to catch, and they had talked for nearly 2 hours in a lobby that neither of them would remember clearly afterward. He had found in her something he had not expected, a directness that he recognized because he valued it in himself. They married in 2014 in a small outdoor ceremony outside Scottsdale, with fewer than 30 guests and a dinner that ran late into the night. Aerocraft Holdings had existed before any of that. Logan had built the first version of the company in 2012 out of a rented garage in the Phoenix suburbs, with 2 mechanics he trusted, and a conviction that the private aviation maintenance market was significantly underserved. He worked the first 2 years without drawing a salary, living on savings and a bank loan he had signed alone, driving the same truck he drove now. By the time he married Charlotte, the company was modestly profitable. 3 hangars, 12 employees, a handful of regional contracts. He had described it to her as a small business in aviation maintenance. That was precisely what it was at the time. What neither of them had fully anticipated was what would happen between 2015 and 2022. The private aviation sector expanded faster than most analysts in the industry had predicted, demand outpaced capacity across the region, and Aerocraft had been positioned, through methodical preparation and in part through timing that Logan would not claim was entirely deliberate, to absorb a disproportionate share of that growth. He hired carefully, he expanded without rushing. He reinvested nearly everything the company earned back into the company itself. In 2017, on advice from his business attorney, he restructured the company's ownership through a holding trust, filing every document with the appropriate regulatory bodies in full and on time. There had been no concealment in it. It was the standard architecture of a company that had grown beyond its original form. The marriage had not broken over a single event. It had broken the way most marriages do, gradually, under accumulating weight, until the structure could no longer hold what was being asked of it. Charlotte had grown increasingly interested, as the years passed, in what Logan had rather than what he was building. He recognized this the way you recognize a change in weather before it becomes weather. And he said nothing, first because he was not certain, then because he was tired, then because the moment for saying it had quietly closed. There had been a specific evening in the autumn of 2019 when she had asked, over dinner, whether he had considered selling the company and doing something else with the money. He had asked what she meant by something else. She had described, in reasonable and pleasant detail, a life that required no early mornings, no unreturned calls from vendors, no thinking about payroll in the background of every conversation. He had understood then that they were no longer talking about the same future. He had said very little that night. Later he would wish he had said more. By 2021 they were living in the same house in the manner of 2 people who have agreed, without any formal discussion, to stop pretending. When Charlotte filed for divorce in early 2022, Logan had felt no surprise and very little anger. He agreed without contest to give her the house, both vehicles registered jointly, and all of their shared savings, a combined amount just over $480,000. He retained his ownership stake in Aerocraft, which independent auditors had assessed at $4,200,000. Charlotte had her own attorney present at every stage of the settlement. The attorney reviewed every document. Charlotte signed. Everything was lawful and complete. 2 years later, Aerocraft Holdings held contracts in 23 states and was currently under review by an institutional investor group that had placed its valuation at $183 million. Not because of anything that had existed before the divorce, because of everything built after it. Judge Owen called the recess at 11:22, and the corridor outside the courtroom filled with the particular energy of people temporarily released from a formal room. Sebastian moved immediately to Charlotte and Jason near the wide windows at the far end of the hall. His posture communicated confidence, measured, analytical, still in control of the morning's narrative. Charlotte's shoulders had loosened by a fraction, the kind of release that comes when a person believes the harder part is behind them. Jason stood with one hand in his jacket pocket and listened to Sebastian with the attentiveness of a man conducting an audit he does not disclose. He was not simply Charlotte's partner in this proceeding. He had spent the previous 6 months making quiet, persistent contact with Caleb, Aerocraft's CFO, through a sequence of intermediary financial firms with carefully bland names. The offer had always been structured the same way: acquisition of Logan's controlling stake at 30% below current market value, with the legal pressure from this very hearing positioned as the mechanism that would bring Logan to the table on unfavorable terms. Jason did not want Charlotte to win a larger settlement. He wanted Logan to be cornered into selling. Those were related goals but not the same goal, and only one of them required Charlotte to understand what was happening. Caleb had declined every approach, briefly, politely, and without explanation. The last communication had contained 2 words. That had been 4 months ago. Jason had since redirected his strategy toward generating enough legal uncertainty to either compel a settlement or compress Aerocraft's valuation during its current investor review window. He was a man who understood leverage. He had identified what he believed was leverage. He had not obtained accurate information about the person he was trying to use it on. Across the corridor, Logan stood near a tall window with Diana beside him. Diana spoke quietly without looking at him directly, the way someone speaks when the words themselves are the entire point. She asked whether he was certain, said it plainly as a real question, not a rhetorical one. She said that after today the quiet distance he had maintained for 4 years would be over. The story would exist in a form that other people could find. Logan was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had lived long enough in the shadow of a truth that was waiting to come out. Today was the day it came out into the light. He did not say it dramatically. He said it the way a man says something he has known for long enough that it no longer requires examination. Diana looked at him, not assessing, just looking, and was quiet in return. His phone vibrated once in his jacket pocket. He did not remove it. He already knew what it contained, he said without turning his head. 4 minutes. Diana nodded and began gathering her papers. The sound arrived before the visual. It came through the tall windows, low, descending, the unmistakable deceleration of a jet engine reducing power for approach. Heads in the corridor turned with the instinctive reflex of people who have heard something unexpected and are trying to place it. Through the glass, moving against the pale blue of the late morning sky, a white aircraft with silver trim was descending toward the smaller regional airfield a few miles to the east. At this distance, the tail marking was small, 2 stylized letters in silver on white, but plainly visible to anyone who knew what they were reading. Charlotte turned toward the sound without meaning to. She looked at the aircraft and looked away, unaware of its significance. Jason also turned. He also looked at the plane. He did not look away for a long moment, and when he finally did, his jaw had tightened by a fraction, and the hand in his jacket pocket had closed around nothing. He excused himself from Sebastian's company, walked quickly to the far end of the corridor, and made a phone call that lasted less than 90 seconds. When he returned, his collar was flushed above the white of his shirt, though his face had been composed back into its practiced neutrality. Sebastian noticed. He said nothing. Logan was already walking toward the courtroom doors, his jacket buttoned, the folder under his arm, moving at exactly the pace he had moved all morning. He said to Diana, "Just loud enough, let's go in." Caleb entered the courtroom 2 minutes after the session resumed. He was 40 years old, had the deliberate movements of a man who spent a significant portion of his time in transit and had long ago optimized everything for efficiency, and wore a suit that communicated seriousness without announcing cost. He carried a leather portfolio thick with labeled sections. He acknowledged no one except Diana, to whom he handed the portfolio across the table, and Logan, who received a single nod and returned it without expression. Charlotte studied Caleb's face. She did not recognize him. Jason studied Caleb's face and went very still. Diana opened the portfolio, arranged the first section of documents, and provided copies to the court clerk and to Sebastian. She began without preamble. Her voice had the quality of someone who has checked her facts 3 times and is not performing confidence but simply delivering it. She stated each point in sequence, without ornamentation. Aerocraft Holdings had been established in 2012, 2 years before Logan and Charlotte had met. At the time of the divorce settlement, Logan had disclosed his ownership stake in full and in compliance with all applicable legal requirements. The valuation of $4,200,000 had been determined by an independent auditing firm and later confirmed within a 4% margin by 2 additional firms separately engaged by Charlotte's own attorney at the time. All 3 assessments were included in the documentation now before the court. All 3 reached consistent conclusions. There had been no manipulation of the valuation, no artificial suppression of assets, no undisclosed liabilities. Charlotte had signed the settlement agreement with independent legal counsel present, advising and signing off on every page. The current valuation of Aerocraft Holdings, as of the most recent institutional investor assessment, completed 11 weeks ago, was $183 million. Diana paused there, not for theatrical effect, simply because she had reached the end of the sentence and there was nothing to add to it that the room could not supply for itself. Judge Owen looked up from the documents. Charlotte's hand resting on the table had gone completely still. Sebastian set his pen down. Diana continued. Every dollar of that growth had occurred after the divorce was finalized. The company had expanded its contract portfolio from 4 regional agreements to 41 national contracts. It had opened 7 additional facilities across 4 states. It had added over 400 personnel to its workforce. None of this had been concealed. None of this had existed at the moment of the settlement. The claim that Logan had deliberately understated the company's value was not supported by any document in existence, and the documents before the court confirmed precisely the opposite, that the valuation had been accurate, conservative by standard industry practice, and entirely appropriate given the company's scale and performance at that time. Sebastian attempted to recover. He challenged the methodology of the original audits, argued that available projections at the time of settlement should have implied a higher figure, and suggested that Logan's restructuring of the company's ownership was evidence of intentional concealment. He used the word opaque again. This time it did not land the same way. The room had changed and every person in it could feel it. Diana had prepared for each of these points. She addressed them in sequence, without raising her voice, citing specific documents for each. The projections Sebastian referenced had not been completed until after the settlement date. She produced the time-stamped filings. The restructuring he called concealment was a standard trust arrangement recommended by Logan's business attorney and filed correctly with all relevant regulatory bodies. She produced those filings as well. She presented a 4th assessment, commissioned independently in the weeks before the hearing, which confirmed that even using the most aggressive forward-looking models available at the time of the settlement, the company's value at that specific moment fell squarely within a reasonable range of the figure Logan had disclosed. Sebastian ran out of surface area to work with. He sat back. Then Logan spoke. It was the first time he had spoken at length in the session, and the room registered it in the slight unconscious shift of attention, shoulders squaring, eyes moving. He did not stand, he did not raise his voice. He spoke in the measured tone of a man who has considered carefully what he wants to say and arrived at the simplest honest version of it. He said that when the marriage ended he had given Charlotte the house they had shared, both vehicles and the full amount of their joint savings. He had not contested any of it. He had not fought for a single item. He had kept the company he had built 2 years before they met, valued by 3 independent firms at a number that all 3 had confirmed was fair. He was not saying this to wound anyone. He was saying it because it was what had happened. Then he was quiet and he remained quiet, looking at no one in particular, his hands flat on the table. Charlotte looked at him, not with the engineered emotion of the morning's testimony. Something more unguarded than that. Something that might, under other circumstances, have led to a different kind of conversation between 2 people who had once understood each other fairly well. Diana set down the second section of documents. This was the material Caleb had carried personally on the flight. It contained 6 months of communications, emails, meeting summaries, and transaction records from 3 intermediary firms, all documenting Jason's coordinated effort to acquire Logan's controlling stake in Aerocraft at 30% below current market value. An internal memo from one of the intermediary firms described the ongoing legal proceedings explicitly as a source of pressure that would, in the firm's own language, motivate the target to accept terms he would not otherwise consider. Jason was no longer still. His foot was moving beneath the gallery bench in small, contained increments that he appeared not to be aware of. Judge Owen read through the second packet with a different quality of attention than he had given the first. Slower, more specific, the way a judge reads something that has moved from a financial dispute into potentially different territory. He looked up. He looked directly at Jason in the gallery. He asked, in a voice that contained no emotion and therefore contained every form of authority that a voice in that room could carry, who this individual was in relation to the matter before the court. Jason said nothing. It was the longest silence Logan had heard from a man who had been performing competence with quiet confidence all morning. Sebastian stood. He spoke in the flat, controlled tone of someone making the only rational decision available to him. He was withdrawing from representation, effective immediately, citing a conflict of interest that had only become apparent to him through the documents now before the court. He requested that the record reflect the timing of his withdrawal. Judge Owen said the record would reflect it. Sebastian gathered his materials with the precise, deliberate efficiency of a man conducting a controlled exit and walked out of the courtroom without looking at Charlotte. The door closed behind him. Charlotte watched it close. Then she looked at Jason. Jason looked at the floor in front of him. Judge Owen issued his ruling without preamble. The court found no evidence of concealment, misrepresentation, or deliberate suppression of assets in the original settlement proceedings. The settlement agreement, executed with proper independent legal counsel for both parties, remained fully valid. The petition was denied in full. Additionally, the court noted that documentation pertaining to the conduct of a third party would be forwarded to the appropriate investigative authority for review and potential further action. He set down the papers. The gavel came down once. The room took a breath. Charlotte did not cry. She did not stand immediately. She sat in the silence after the ruling, the way someone sits after something they built for a long time has simply stopped working. Not in fury, but in the particular difficult stillness of a person beginning, for the first time, to understand the actual shape of what happened. Not what she had told herself had happened, what had actually happened. Jason was on his feet before the echo of the gavel had fully settled. He did not look at Charlotte. He did not speak to anyone in the room. He picked up his jacket from the gallery bench, moved through the row of seats with the polished efficiency of a man maintaining composure by sheer will, and walked out through the courtroom door. It closed behind him without drama. Charlotte watched it close and understood, in the way that certain things only become clear at the precise moment of their irreversibility, that Jason had never been in this room for her. She found him in the corridor near the exterior doors. She asked him directly, without preface, because there was no longer any reason to arrange her questions with care, had he known about the company from the beginning. Jason stopped walking. He stood still in the corridor light for a moment, and in that moment Charlotte watched something move across his face. Not guilt exactly, but a calculation, the brief flicker of a man deciding which version of the truth was worth offering. Then he said he had not known it was that large. The phrasing was careful. It was not a denial. It was not an apology. It was a confirmation wrapped in just enough words to technically read as something else, and Charlotte had been a perceptive woman for long enough to hear exactly what was underneath it. She thought about all the conversations they had shared over the previous 18 months. She thought about how often Jason had asked, in passing, seemingly casual questions about Logan's business, how many people he employed, whether he ever talked about the contracts, whether she had any sense of where the company stood. She had thought he was curious. She understood now what kind of curiosity it had been. She did not ask anything further. She did not need to. Jason left through the glass doors. Charlotte stood in the corridor. The sounds of the building continued around her in the ordinary, indifferent way of places that do not pause for the private things that occur inside them. Logan came out of the courtroom behind her and walked to the exterior steps, where he stopped in the afternoon sun. He was not looking at Charlotte. He was not looking at anything in particular. He stood there for a moment with his face in the light and his eyes closed, and whatever was in his expression was not triumph and not relief in any conventional sense. It was quieter than both, the way a person looks when they have been carrying something for a long time and have finally set it down, and are simply standing in the changed feeling of that. Caleb shook his hand at the base of the steps. Logan thanked him for making the flight. Caleb said that was what he was there for. Logan looked at him sideways and said he was paid too much for the job. Caleb said that was probably true, but he had never raised it himself. Logan smiled, a brief, unguarded smile, the kind that happens before a person decides whether to let it. Charlotte came down the steps behind them. She stopped when she saw Logan standing there. Neither of them moved for a moment in the ordinary way of people who have nothing left to perform for each other. Then she said his name. He turned. She looked at him the way she had not looked at him in a very long time, without calculation, without the scaffolding of an argument or a presentation underneath it. She asked why he had never told her. About all of it. Logan was quiet. Not because he lacked an answer. He had lived with the answer long enough to know its shape exactly. He was quiet the way he always was when something mattered enough to say correctly. Then he told her that by the time telling her would have changed anything, it would not have changed anything. And what had been true at the end of the marriage was still true now. Charlotte was quiet. She did not argue with it. There was nothing in it to argue with. It was the most honest thing either of them had said to the other in a long time, and they both knew it. Logan turned and walked toward the parking lot. Diana was still near the entrance, reorganizing the portfolio with the precise attention of someone who processes the end of a difficult thing by putting it back in order. She had removed the formal jacket she had worn in court and stood in her white shirt in the afternoon light, which made her look slightly less like an attorney and slightly more like herself. She looked up when she heard Logan's footsteps on the pavement. The parking lot had largely cleared. The newer vehicles were gone, the spaces emptied out to the ordinary vacancy of a Tuesday afternoon. The Ford F-150 sat at the far edge in the mild light, looking as it always did, unremarkable in every way to anyone who did not know what it was. Diana followed his gaze out to the truck. She asked if he needed a ride. She said Caleb's car was on the north side. If Logan needed to reach the airfield, Caleb would be heading back within the hour. Logan shook his head. He said he would take his truck. Diana looked at the truck for a moment with the directness that Logan had come to expect from her and genuinely appreciated. Then she asked him, plainly and without ceremony, why. Not as a challenge, as an actual question. She wanted to understand why a man who owned an aircraft chose a rusted pickup truck as his primary vehicle and evidently intended to go on doing so. Logan put his hand on the doorframe, not reaching for the key, just resting his palm on the metal itself. He said he had bought the truck in 2009. Aerocraft at that point was a garage, 2 mechanics, and 3 contracts, and he had taken a bank loan to fund the first year of operations. He said that every time he looked at the truck, he remembered what it had felt like to have nothing but a direction and enough stubbornness to keep going. And when you forget where you started, he said, you begin to believe that the things you have are things you deserved. He did not think the things he had were deserved. He thought they were built. And the difference between those two ideas was important enough to hold on to. Diana looked at him in the afternoon light without speaking for a moment. Not appraising, not analyzing, just holding what he had said. Then she told him she had a question that was not strictly professional. Logan said the professional part of the day appeared to be behind them. She asked if he drank coffee. He said he did. She said she was choosing the location, because if she let him choose, they would end up at a place with plastic chairs and a menu unchanged since the early 1990s. Logan said that was exactly where he went every Tuesday morning and he saw no reason to change. Diana said she believed him entirely and that was precisely why she was choosing. He laughed, short and real, the kind that comes without preparation, and it was, as Diana would think about later, the first completely unguarded sound he had made all day. The rest of the day had required precision. He had given it. This was what remained when precision was no longer required. She walked to her car on the other side of the lot. As she reached it, she heard the old truck's engine turn over. The slightly rough, particular sound of an engine that has been started in many kinds of weather and has never once failed. There was something steady in it that was not quite comfort but was close. To the east, above the low line of buildings at the edge of the city, the white shape of the aerocraft jet was climbing into the pale afternoon sky, banking south, becoming smaller. Logan did not watch it go. He already knew where it was headed. The life Logan would return to was not dramatically different from the one he had left that morning. The same apartment, the same chipped mug, the same 5 o'clock alarm that no one had ever asked him to set. None of that would change, and he had no intention of changing it. The things that had always mattered to him had never required an audience, and they did not require one now. What had changed was something quieter and more final than any of that. The weight of a truth held close for too long, the sustained effort of maintaining silence in the face of people who read that silence as weakness. That weight was gone. He had not known, until it lifted, exactly how much of him it had been taking. He pulled out of the lot and into the city, driving west into the long afternoon. He drove with the window down and one arm resting on the door in the easy, unhurried way of someone moving through a world they are at peace with. He had done nothing dramatic today, had made no revelations designed to wound anyone, had delivered no speech intended for memory. He had brought a truth into a room where the truth needed to be, and he had let it stand. That was all it had ever needed to be. That had always been enough.